Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, welcome. Thanks for being here. We're going to talk today about the media and crime and criminal justice. And let me introduce to you who we have. I'm KIRSTEN DANIS. I'm the managing editor at the Marshall Project. For those of you who don't know, we are a nonprofit news organization that focuses on the U.S. criminal justice system. Right here to my right, we have MELANIE EVERSLEY. MELANIE is a journalist based in New York City who writes about social issues and civil rights. From 2004 until last month, she was a reporter at USA Today, where she covered, among many other things, the death of Freddie Gray and Eric Garner and the closing of Rikers Island. She's also worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Detroit Free Press. And then we have CARIMAH Towns. CARIMAH is a reporter based in Washington, D.C. She covers criminal justice at the county and state level for the Fair Punishment Project and Slate.com. She's currently focused on prosecutorial discretion and the relationship between poverty and mass incarceration. And before that, she wrote about policing, conditions of confinement, racial justice, and pop culture for Think Progress. And we also have Shila Juwan. Shila is the national criminal justice editor at the New York Times. She's covered crime and criminal justice for more than a decade, including in the South and the NYPD. And as a national correspondent, she focused on the effect of lower-level criminal charges on indigent defendants. So thanks so much for being here, everybody. And just a couple little housekeeping things. This is a fairly short panel, so we're going to talk among ourselves here for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So get those questions ready. And I think we're gonna start with a question that I'm hoping everyone here can weigh in on, and that is, in the time that you've been covering this issue, what changes have you seen in the way that the media covers crime and criminal justice, in the language that it uses, in the topics that we choose to cover, and the amount of time and space and resources that we devote to it? Can we start with you, MELANIE? Oh, you're gonna wanna use that.
Sorry about that. I've worked at newspapers for most of my career, and the biggest change is that newspapers have shrunk. Staffs are smaller, and where perhaps folks once had beats where they could visit people every day and get to know the officials and the neighborhoods that they cover, and kind of do FaceTime on the street so that people would trust them more and learn, that they could open up to them. A lot more often now, because staffs are smaller, we're just kind of jumping into stories. And kind of getting to know people on the fly. I think that's an important issue, because a lot of times with criminal justice, there's an issue of communities not trusting the media. And because we're not as present on the street, I think that that's an issue. Also, social media has changed the game, actually, in a good way. People are shooting video of incidents, and it's kind of getting out there in a grassroots way, even before the media is aware of certain incidents. So that's been a good thing. And then finally, I was just going to say, editors, of course, one of their concerns is making sure that they're reaching readers and producing what readers feel as if they need. So they're always looking at numbers, whether it's readership or clicks or whatever. I think before Trayvon Martin, there may have been a feeling in some newsrooms that certain incidents that happened really had to go through a litmus test of whether it genuinely happened. Have we talked to enough people? But I think after the Trayvon Martin case, and after Ferguson especially, editors began to see that people really had a hunger for that kind of news, whether they were familiar with the sorts of communities that these incidents happened in or not.
CARIMAH, what have you noticed, and especially in readership among maybe younger readers, what are they interested in? Are they interested in things they weren't before?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest change that I've seen, so I think a lot of us agreed in previous conversations that Ferguson really changed the media landscape when we're talking about criminal justice and police violence and just all of these systems and how they're playing out. And I think people are just taking a more thoughtful approach in general to how they're covering these issues. I think that there's a lot more nuance now, and I think that editors and reporters understand that there are perspectives that have traditionally been left out of this conversation, and so they're more interested in uplifting marginalized voices in a way that they haven't before. And then there's also the visual element. I think video and social media has played a really big role in our storytelling in a way that just wasn't happening before. And I think that the other thing that I've noticed is there's a lot more data collection around some of these issues. I mean, like The Guardian, Washington Post, they've created these, police shooting databases, and there's more. I think there's a greater urgency and a greater need to start looking at the numbers, and so I think there's been more of an emphasis on that as well.
Now, Shayla, when we were talking before, you described the differences as stark. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a crescendo, and I think it started really with the Innocence Project and the exonerations that just started to gather steam, and those big stories about people on death row who were not guilty really planted the seeds that there is something significantly wrong with the system that we have. And I was always really bugged by those stories because I was always thinking, if this is what's happening to people on death row, what's happening to the people further down the chain? It must be much worse. But there was sort of no traction to talk about that, I think, until a number of things, but for me, Ferguson is really a watershed moment because you not only have a dead black man lying in the street, but then you have this accompanying report about all of the ways in which the population, and particularly the black population, were just systematically harassed with low-level offenses and churned through this justice system and put into a cycle of debt and not being able to afford bail and their fines, and that just really, it somehow broke something open to where you could really look at this. I think, it's not being on death row, but there's a huge impact that these low-level cases, which affect far, far more people, can have on people's lives, and just how out of whack those consequences have gotten with what we think of as, just consequences for minor infractions. So that's one way of thinking about it. There's also the fact that so many Americans have a criminal record. I just saw a new report that 1 in 3 black men have a felony record. And that's a small slice. When you look at what estimates are for all Americans, it's huge. So it's becoming less possible to otherize the criminal, which is what America loves to do, right? You're criminal, you don't deserve any more rights, we can put you in a really hot, horrible prison, and who cares, has become, wait a minute, we need to do something about rehabilitation and making sure your punishment can end and looking at collateral consequences. It's all of a piece to be.
So I think we all think that there have been shifts in the way that the media covers crime and talks about crime and does try to delve into the effects that it's had on a broader reach of the population. But let's talk about Donald Trump. I think fair to say that some of the rhetoric that's come out of Washington has kind of combated that tide, right? We talk about the terrible murder rates in Chicago. MS-13 is at your door. These things affect the way that people think about crime. And do you think the media has responded to that? Do you think that the media has countered that narrative, if it deserves countering? And do you think that it could set back some of the conversations that we've been having since Trayvon Martin, since Ferguson, since these events happened? Melanie, do you want to start?
Sure. I think my view has been a little skewed because I'm here in New York City. A large number of people kind of feel the same about this issue. But I think in some ways what I've seen is that this administration has made the media defiant because so many individual news organizations have been called out and accused of producing fake news. Editors and publishers are saying we're going to stay on this administration and make sure we keep them honest. So from where I sit, my ability to cover those issues hasn't really changed.
What about you, Shiloh?
Well, I mean, I think the desire to mine the gap between the rhetoric and the reality is very present. It's hard to do because a lot of cases where Sessions will come in and say, oh, Chicago, if you would just arrest all the illegal immigrants, then you wouldn't have this crime problem. Well, it's actually, we tried to figure out, is there data for that? Could we look at that? And there isn't that we know of. So it's very hard to pick those things apart. But it's a really clear line what's going on, talking about a new crime wave, right? Fear-mongering, connecting it to immigration. I mean, it's all sort of part of a strategy that we need in the media to definitely pay close attention to and try as best we can to pick it apart. I think there have been some efforts to do that in some ways, but I mean, it's been pointed out many times, I think, that immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes, but whether, it remains to be seen how much traction that gets. And also, I think watching the way public opinion responds to this, do people buy it? Is there a sea change? I mean, you definitely saw a sea change right after Trayvon and Ferguson. Does it start to go back the other way? I mean, I think it's all a question right now.
CARIMAH?
So yeah, I think the good thing about my job is I don't have to really pay attention to Trump as much as other people because we are really focused on the county and the state level. But that said, I do think the media has generally done a really good job of countering this narrative that he's come up with and that his administration has come up with in terms of crime rates, just violent criminals out in the streets. I think people have really done a good job of pushing back on that. I also, social media, I think, is in a lot of ways, it's just where reporters can just kind of talk at each other, but I think in those conversations, there's a consensus that what Trump is saying is factually incorrect. And so I think social media has been another way of really countering that narrative and just having these conversations in a way that's outside of the traditional media that he's trying to discredit, but also I think equally valid in reaching people to just counter what he's saying, if that makes sense.
That makes terrific sense. I mean, something that I think about a lot as watching this kind of pendulum swing is, for quite some time, the victim narrative is what dominated news coverage of crime. And now we are starting to think about things more contextually, I hope, more deeply, more subtly. But I do sometimes wonder, when you guys think about crime and you write about crime, how do you think about the victim of the crime? How do you try to weave those narratives together? Is it something that you are concerned about when you're writing about things? Anyone can feel free to jump right in.
And I think it is, you do have to constantly remember that, reach out, try to talk to victims of the crimes you're writing about. A lot of low-level crimes are victimless, or the victim is like Walmart, or it's a more abstract victim. So, but I think it's important to just get a rounded sense. We did a story recently about a guy who'd been in jail awaiting trial for 10 years. And we were careful to go to the victim's family, it was a murder, and say, how do you feel about the fact that this has been dragging on for 10 years? And they were like, we also hate it. So, it's not, it's important to get that view and not, definitely don't want, though you're right, that the context has sort of shifted, if you lose sight of the fact that people are victimized by crime, you're gonna lose your audience and your readers. I wanted to say something about something CARIMAH said, which is the idea of covering state and local, which is where most of criminal justice happens, right, at the state and local level. And so this can be incredibly frustrating in a way because there's, more than 1,000 criminal justice systems in this country. And so, you know, there's not like a Harvey Weinstein of the criminal justice system. And so sometimes your targets can be very small in a way that if you're writing for a national paper, you have to constantly think about, like, how do I make this national, and especially in the Trump environment, when the things he's talking about are not going to play out so much on a federal or national stage as they are going to play out on a state and local and county level stage. It's just, I think, complicates the job.
Well, KARIMAH, can you talk a little bit about the Fair Punishment Project and its partnership with Slate, which I think is it's a departure of sorts from the kind of journalism that we were born into and grew up with. You know, the Fair Punishment Project does take stances on things. It files amicus briefs, and when you think of yourself as a journalist, what are you focusing on? How do you consider yourself? How do you consider your role as a journalist?
So yeah, so we publish on Slate. So the Fair Punishment Project is based at Harvard, and we kind of take a very specific approach to this work. We see ourselves as a research organization that has a journalism component. So I don't see myself as an advocate in any way. I see myself as somebody who's conveying information to the public, just like any other journalist. But that said, because we're a research organization, we have identified very specific drivers of mass incarceration. And so I see my personal role as like looking at those actors and looking at the policies that are affecting local criminal justice systems. But I think also we're trying to sort of shift the framework in a way that maybe, I guess, traditional news outlets aren't. So, and Slate has given us a platform to do that. We also have our own vertical on Medium. It's called Injustice Today. But yeah, we're trying to, again, shift the focus to a local framework, because there's a very specific set of, you know, there's different playbooks for the local actors. But we're also trying to get people to focus on different actors who may not have as much visibility in the system, which I don't want to get too in-depth with it, but we're focused on prosecutors, and I think a lot of the media conversation has been about policing, which is a big part of it. But at the Fair Punishment Project, we're really interested in the way that prosecutors interact with the system at every sort of step in the criminal justice process, and focusing on how they shape local systems.
The fact that there is a media outlet that focuses on criminal justice at the local and state level, and you are a reporter who specifically focuses on prosecutorial discretion, I think speaks kind of volumes about the way we're thinking about these things right now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating position to be in, because again, like a lot of the conversation is dominated by Trump. He monopolizes national attention, but the more that we can pull out these local stories and get people to care about those as well, I think that's where the change is really going to happen. And so we're not advocates, but we're definitely looking at trying to shift people's framework of how they think about these topics.
And how do you get people to care about a prosecutor in Madison, Wisconsin?
For me, it's really just about educating people about what prosecutors do. I don't think that they're not out there policing people in the streets every day, so we just don't think about them much. But just talking about the role that they have, that they play in everything from, you know, setting bail and sentencing and charging, and they influence policing. And so I think it's connecting real people's stories with the role that prosecutors play. It's just making that connection. And I think once people see that and read it, they're like, oh, that makes total sense. Why were we not talking about that before? That's been my experience, at least.
I mean, but this is also part of the stark change that we're talking about, which is that I think, 5 years ago, no one cared about bail.
Right.
That just wasn't even a thing. And I did a long story about one woman's drunk driving probation. Like, that was not a story that I could have done before Ferguson. There's just a huge difference in the level of attention you can pay to certain issues.
Melanie, you worked at one of the most popular and mainstream newspapers in the country, right? USA Today. So how would you sell a story to an editor in this topic, and did that change over your time there? What did you have to do to get someone's interest, and did that shift?
Oh, it most definitely shifted. USA Today is a little bit different than some of the other larger news organizations because the readers are a little bit more affluent, more male. There are fewer people of color reading USA Today. So it was harder to sell stories that came from like a civil rights angle to my editors. They would always ask, well, why would our readers care? And again, I do think that Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown changed the game, because editors began to see that people do care. And one thing I would do, like in the last couple of years, I was able to share with editors that this thing is going viral on social media. A lot of people are talking about it. And I think we can be ahead of the game if we start writing about it now. Another thing that helped was USA Today is owned by Gannett, which has news organizations across the country. So we would share resources. And if something happened in a community where we had a news operation, we were able to share resources that way. So that helped also. In recent years, people have become more interested in visuals, video, social media. I always tried to stay up on my skills, and if it looked as if there might be some kind of potential for showing the story on video, then that helped also.
Let's talk a little bit about video. All of us up here on the stage are generally word people, more or less. I mean, we've all tried to be multimedia, some maybe with more success than others. But I think video is a huge component of what changed this conversation in the country. And can you talk a little bit, maybe KARIMAH, if we could start with you, about images that have stuck with you and inform the way you think about crime and criminal justice when you write about it?
Sure. So yeah, I started writing about criminal justice in the wake of Ferguson, or actually no, during the Ferguson uprising. And so one of the most powerful images that has stuck with me since 2014 is that of, I believe his name was Edward Crawford, maybe Edmund Crawford. But it's this photo, it's an iconic photo, I'm sure everybody's seen it, where he's holding a bag of chips, I think, in one hand. He's wearing an American flag t-shirt, and he's like getting ready to throw a tear gas canister back at some entity, that presumably police, I don't know. But it's like, it's sparkling, or sparks are flying. And that always stuck with me because, here's in the midst of all of this outrage and chaos and just despair over the killing of black bodies with impunity. Like, here was this black man like putting his body on the line and being resilient and showing agency at a time when I guess like the people who he was confronting in the moment didn't want him to have that agency. So that was probably the photo that has stuck with me the most and really made me want to tell these stories.
The videos have also shown us that there's some problem with how the cops are not putting their bodies on the line. That's what they're paid to do, right? And so when you watch video after video of oh, I thought for a minute he might have been reaching for something, so I killed him. And it's it doesn't really matter it does matter, but whatever a jury thinks when they see those videos, the public is just faced with an incontrovertible sight of, Walter Scott running away and getting shot in the back. And you cannot, they just provide this sort of what we think of as inarguable evidence that something is wrong. So that's why the videos have been, we think of video, whether it is or not, as being a truth-telling device that can't be argued with. And so they're powerful, and they're teaching us, like you said, they're teaching us what our readers care about.
I'm just going to say, I think also video adds another element. Like you were saying, it provides irrefutable evidence of what happened, but also it gives you a chance to kind of show another layer. I love words. I've been a writer for a lot of years, but there are certain stories that can be told in a different way in video. I went to Baltimore to interview people who were living in the neighborhood where Freddie Gray died about a year after he died. And a lot of the people were, I guess, more comfortable just talking to the camera on my cell phone than having me, take notes. And also just because the way a lot of platforms are set up, you can run longer, more in-depth videos and do a lot more showing that add another element to the story.
Oh, I was just going to say, another point that I'd like to make is that with these video capabilities, like people who aren't traditional reporters are able to tell these stories, and we're seeing a lot more than we would have 5 years ago because people are posting 30-second clips on Twitter of, a protest or an arrest or whatever it may be. So the stories, I think, are more potent because it's not just journalists talking at people and telling or showing what people are supposed to care about. It's like people telling these stories themselves.
Well, it's informing so many levels of the system, right? I mean, the Times had a story just today about 2 officers in New York who were indicted for perjury and lying during investigations, and it was just regular citizen video and surveillance video of incidents, run-of-the-mill, everyday incidents, that led to this to this arrest. So I mean, this is, I think, now a new part of the way that we cover things, and it's vital, I think, too.
Wasn't there did you guys have that story yesterday about the Fitbit?
No, that wasn't us. No, I don't think. Yeah, your Fitbit can.
Like a Fitbit tracking someone's movements, which disproved her husband's story. So just like this idea that there's going to be more and more data, which means juries are going to expect more.
Let's talk about data for just a second. I know there was a whole panel on this, so I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on it, but it is one of the deep frustrations of doing this beat, I think, about how little centralized and useful data there is. Do you see that changing? No, no one sees that changing. Oh, well, okay.
It's just so many flaws, right? Like, no matter what data pool you get, it's flawed in some way. And there's some great new efforts to measure things and to measure them for the benefit of the system, not even for the benefit of journalists, that Measures for Justice being an example. But it is, I mean, I think everybody in the field in one way or another recognizes the need for better data, except maybe the DOJ.
We're talking a little bit about how this stuff came, how the conversation started to change, how the media started to change. I'm wondering, though, this wasn't something that happened overnight. Mass incarceration wasn't something that didn't exist in 1993 and then it existed in 1995, right? This was a slow build-up. And as this happened over 2 decades, decade and a half, and as the crime rate went down, this still didn't get the kind of attention it gets now. Why do you think that is? Is there something wrong with the way the media covers this beat, with the way we think about ourselves, with the way we interact with communities and the country, that this kind of went unnoticed until a flashpoint?
Speaking from the perspective of an African-American reporter, some of the other African-American journalists that I know, we all have been aware of certain issues, and it has been a hard sell over the years, becoming less and less so. I'm not sure why the sea changes happened, but I do think that some of the more publicized cases have kind of opened some folks' eyes. I did have I had a colleague who would get choked up every time we talked about the Eric Garner case because the video had really moved him. I think the documentary 13th opened a lot of eyes, as well as the case of Kalief Browder. And I think it kind of got people beginning to see how trends over a few decades can really affect communities.
A combination, I think, of the singular stories that you're talking about. Kalief Browder being a great example of just something where you're just like, no, like the more you read. But it's accompanied by data, right? Even though the data is bad in general, that you've seen more and more studies, traffic stop studies, for example, or just like who gets cited, who gets searched. And in the face of more and more of that, it also becomes sort of like incontrovertible that again, I think I've used that word before in this conversation, but that you know, you have something to present that says, this is not just Eric Garner. This is Eric Garner plus.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it goes back to the visual elements, but I also think we should give credit to like the Black Lives Matter movement itself. I think they've been demanding to be seen and heard in a way that they're. Hey. Yeah, no, I mean, they are putting their lives on the line, their bodies on the line, and saying, you're going to hear us and you're going to see us. And so I think with that, and social media has played a big role in, you know, getting their message out. And so I think through their efforts, we're really focusing on issues in a way that we just haven't before. But again, it's weird because, I mean, you've been doing this longer than I have, but I've only been doing this reporting work in the moment of Ferguson and beyond. So like I think my perspective is a little bit different in terms of what came before and why it was a certain way than after Ferguson and how that's changed. So, yeah.
Well, I think newsrooms in general have been rightly criticized for not having a diverse representation of the population, especially at their upper levels, right? Now, newsrooms are pretty white. Do you think that that affected the way that we covered this topic?
Yeah, and I mean, I want to be clear that there's definitely more nuanced conversation about this, but there's a long way to go in terms of diversifying newsrooms and straying away from a lot of the coded rhetoric that I think still comes up in headlines and the stories that we're telling. And so I think that's testament to the fact that, you know, some things have changed, but there's still a lot of harmful rhetoric out there, and we have a long way to go, I think.
I just want to add, I think things regressed for a while just because, you know, with the advent of the web, fewer people were buying newspapers, and news organizations are still trying to figure out how to make back that money from not being able to sell ads. In the 90s, I think there were a lot of major news organizations that were really pushing diversity as an issue that they cared about. But as newsrooms started to shrink and budgets started to shrink, that was one of the issues that kind of fell by the wayside a little bit.
I think there's also a class issue as well as a race issue in newsrooms that we have to acknowledge. I mean, my boss is black and his brother is an FBI agent, not, you know, I mean, it's like there's a different perspective in that way as well.
So we have a little bit of time left, and I think we can open it up to questions from the audience. Hi, you were very enthusiastic. Do you need the mic? You got it? Okay.
Are you the one who started the applause for Black Lives Matter? That was over here somewhere.
I participated. My name is Darrell Atkinson. I'm co-director of Forward Justice. Before I took on that role, I had the pleasure of working for Miss Carol Mason at the Office of Justice Programs as the first second chance fellow for the U.S. Department of Justice. And I'm also a formerly incarcerated person. And for years, formerly incarcerated people have been combating the stigma that we face in society. And part of that stigma is the language that's used to describe us. Ex-convict, ex-offender, ex-felon. And we've been pushing, similar to the undocumented community, when they initiated the I campaign with the Associated Press to stop using the word illegal to describe people because it describes conduct.
Absolutely. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I'm going there.
We have limited time, so we just want to get to that question.
Similarly, I'm asking, can we get a commitment from all of your news outlets to stop using pejorative labels like ex-convict, ex-felon, ex-offender to describe people? And you can use people with records, returning citizens, things of that nature, because it further solidifies the stigma that we're trying to overcome.
Can I make a suggestion? I remember the battle, or I remember the discussions over the word undocumented, and I think that new word began to successfully get out there to newsrooms when the interested organizations contacted major journalism organizations, and then at their national conventions, we were able to get the word out to large groups of journalists. So I would suggest reaching out to those groups.
So no committee.
Well, I don't think Melanie
we don't
can...
have the power to
Take it back to your
Well, I'm a freelancer, so, but you know, I'm happy to get the word. I actually have been discussing this very issue with other journalists I know, but I'm just saying if you wanted to get the word out to large groups of people, I think major journalism organizations would be receptive.
I think that, you know, I mean, the news organization I work for is inherently conservative, and these changes do happen, but they happen more slowly probably than anyone would want. And they do sometimes come from the reporter up in a way, because reporters make a lot of choices about their wording, and they can push back. You know, I know that, for example, the Times has rebuffed attempts to be corrected on language concerning addiction, like not using the word addict, for example. And then, you know, I edited a whole story about a person with an addiction, and I just said, okay, I'm going to try it. I'm not going to use the word addict. I think I succeeded maybe like 99%. So it's just, and then this came up with our standards editor later, and he actually brought it up in front of a group of people, like, oh, you know, I've gotten these comments about using the word addict, but it's so cumbersome, right, to say person with addiction. And I just said, Phil, I just did it in a story. And it was like a 2,000 word big story. So, you know, just those things, it's like, it's probably always going to be more incremental than you want, but it is about, like, you know, someone I really respect who knows a lot about addiction saying this to me going like, okay, I kind of see your point, you know. So it's just it's like a dialectic.
Yeah, I mean, we're very much a startup, and so I think there's room to take this, you know, point back to our newsroom. I think we all, at least on my staff, I can't speak for the others up here, but I think at our job we are really conscious of the language that we're using to describe individuals. So like within the past few years, I've tried to stop. I mean, I don't say inmate anymore, for example, and I think that there's a lot of, at least the people that I work with, because we're just focused on criminal justice, we're trying to build this new language and framework. I think that, you know, I can definitely take that back and say, let's just make sure that we're really thinking about how we're describing the folks that we're talking about.
Glenn Martin has been working on this too, whose organization is one of the sponsors of this. But he, you know, I think he sent me a thing about person-centered language describing people with a criminal justice history. So it's bubbling around out there.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Here, you want to grab this one? I got it.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Alex Duran. I'm with the Ford Foundation. So my question is, you mentioned irrefutable evidence videos, and we have seen that a number of grand juries haven't handed down indictments when it comes to the killing of unarmed black men in New York with Eric Garner, in Minnesota, in Ferguson. Do you think that even in the face of irrefutable evidence, justice is not being accomplished? I mean, we saw that, you know, that video with Donald Trump talking about sexual assault, and he still was elected president. I'm not too confident that irrefutable evidence that we see in this video is going to get us justice.
I guess what I was trying to say is that when the public views the video, right, it means one thing to them. It's very impactful to see it, and they're not a prosecutor who's deciding whether to bring charges. They're not a grand jury deciding whether to return an indictment. They're not a jury deciding whether to convict. That raises a whole another level of considerations. So what they're seeing, though, I think is incontrovertible in the sense that they're seeing how quickly these situations arise and are resolved, and how what's the word I'm looking for? Trigger happy, right? Maybe is the right word. The police can be, which is different from, you know, whether there is a criminal justice solution. And I'm not going to, you know, I don't know whether how that will evolve over time. We've seen some indication that prosecutors are more willing to bring charges, but the way the laws are now and the case law is now, there's a huge benefit of the doubt goes to the law enforcement officer. And we basically have a situation where it's all about the law enforcement officer's perception of whether they were in danger or other people could have been in danger. And so all they have to say is, I perceived it. And then it becomes very hard to prove otherwise. That's the problem in the court system right now. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Sort of, yeah. I know it's not. There's no satisfying answer to that question.
Maybe we have time for one more. Am I getting a? Hi. Right here in the middle. Hi.
Is this working? Okay. Hi, I'm Poonam Mantha. I'm at the Vera Institute of Justice. Just first of all, thank you for your time. This was a really engaging conversation. I just wanted to, it's notable that the four of you are four women on this stage. And I think we've heard the names Trayvon and Walter Scott and, Khalif Browder and all of that, but we've never heard the name Sandra Bland. And I'm just curious if there is a sort of pushback in your field of covering women in these positions, and why you think that there is kind of a shift towards narratives surrounding men.
Sorry, I didn't hear the.
She's asking why women in the system are comparatively undercovered, I think. Is that correct? I just want to say the Marshall Project just did a thing with Teen Vogue on women and girls and incarceration. So that was a first for us and very eye-opening.
I'm just going to speak for the newsroom that I worked in. I think it was really just a matter of numbers. There are so many cases involving women and men that have gone uncovered because, at least in the newsrooms that I'm familiar with, people just don't have the time because staffs have really been reduced. So you kind of cover the stories that you have time to do that seem to be affecting the largest number of people, and then others unfortunately go by the wayside. I remember about a year ago for a story, I was putting together just a list of people of color who'd been injured or who died during altercations with the police, and there were about, over the last 5 years, there were about 10 that I had never even heard of, not because they weren't just as dramatic as some of the other cases, just because there's so many now, and the resources in the mainstream newsrooms are becoming more and more limited.
Yeah, I think every story is different, and Sandra Bland's story is tangibly different from the stories that we've mentioned here, which were like the most explosive. But I do think you're already going to see this changing, and you will continue to see it change. And in part, that's because newsrooms do have bias, but they're rational in a way, and there's data about this. More women are having encounters with the criminal justice system. More women are being incarcerated, and I'm sure that fed into the Marshall Project's recent event, and so you'll see it change just because of that.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm a Black woman, and so in my own personal work, I have tried to, give equal weight to Black men and Black women, and but again, covering Sandra Bland is equally important. But I think newsrooms are very much male-dominated in a lot of ways, and so I think we're just automatically primed to think about men, and there's increasingly more data on women in the system, and it's coming out, but I think a lot of our framework is about Black men in particular, and so that's just kind of a point of reference that a lot of us are using. But you're right, we absolutely should have brought up Sandra Bland, Gina McMillan. There's so many people that whose names don't get the attention that they deserve. So yeah, I think all of us should be making a conscious effort to tell those stories and really search for those stories.
So I think that's about it. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming.